Welcome, everyone, especially our visitors, to this online gathering of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Bowling Green. My name is Nick Brady, and I'm your service associate. We are a welcoming congregation. Whoever you are, however you identify, wherever you come from, and whoever you love, you're welcome here. Our Sunday services are different each week so that we can learn and honor a wide array of traditions and beliefs. This morning, Dr. Sam McFarland will be our guest speaker. For Unitarian Universalists, the flaming chalice is a symbol of the light of learning and the love of our community. This morning, our chalice will be lit by my wife, Tressa Brady. As our congregation's chalice is lit, Forrest will play Rise Up, O Flame.
Rise up, O flame, by thy
Today's opening reading is by Judy Chicago. And then all that has divided us will merge, and then compassion will be wedded to power. And then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind, and then both men and women will be gentle. And then both women and men will be strong, and then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all will be rich and free and varied, and then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance, and then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young, and then all will cherish life's creatures. And then all will live in harmony and with each other and the earth, and then everywhere will be called Eden once again.
Let there be an offering to sustain and strengthen this community. While we listen to the offertory music, we invite you to donate to our church by sending checks to our church office at 2033 Nashville Road. will now have a few moments for meditation, reflection, and prayer. After the silence, we'll sing Spirit of Life.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Here to share his thoughts today is Dr. Sam McFarland. Sam was a professor of psychology at WKU from 1971 to 2013. In the 1990s, he also directed the university's honors program, where he developed a course on understanding human rights, which he taught for 20 years. He's now trying to complete a book on about 30 persons who made major contributions to advancing human rights.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam McFarland. I won't be visible on the following slides, but I want to take just a moment to introduce myself and to thank the Unitarian Universalist Church for inviting me to give this presentation. My presentation today is on Kevin Bales and the struggle to end modern-day slavery. Let me first of all introduce Kevin Bales. He was born in rural Oklahoma in 1952, received a degree in anthropology from the University of Oklahoma, a master's degree from the University of Mississippi, and eventually a PhD degree in the social sciences from the London School of Economics. He is a professor at the University of Nottingham in England. He helped establish Pell and Bales, which is a charity that has raised over $1 billion for medical work around the world. He was born as a reared as a Southern Baptist, but is now a practicing Quaker. No one has done more to expose modern-day slavery than has Kevin Bales. When he was in 1993, he saw a leaflet that said there's still millions of slaves in the world today, but when he started digging into it academically, he could find no solid information on modern-day slavery. So effectively, he decided to study it himself. And the way he decided to do it was to go to 5 different countries and look at the specific forms of slavery there. He wanted to look not so much to get statistical count of how many slaves, but to study the culture, the economy, and the other factors, the traditions, the religion, the factors that promoted and sustained slavery in these countries. And so the places he decided to go was to study child prostitution in Thailand, to study agricultural labor in India, to study charcoal production in Brazil, to study brick making in Pakistan, and to study water delivery in Mauritania. He went to each of these countries, found some able assistance from other people. He interviewed both slaves and slave owners. He was always careful when interviewing slaves to not endanger them. And when he published later, he certainly was careful to change their names so as to not endanger them. He, of course, picked up some hard stories. One in particular was when he was studying charcoal production in Brazil, which is used to make steel, which may be in many of our cars. He discovered a man who was offered a job, driven to a distant place where he was effectively enslaved, had no way to get back, was effectively unpaid, and so he was essentially enslaved to make charcoal in Brazil. Sometimes in other countries he found a bit more humane stories. In Mauritania, sometimes slaves were treated cruelly, but sometimes they were regarded pretty much as family members, but they were nonetheless slaves. When he interviewed the slave holders, he sometimes says, I was not completely honest with them. When he was studying agricultural labor in India, for example, he tapped his background as being reared on a farm. He would ask about crop rotations, about fertilizer and other things like that. And pretty soon the slave owners would branch out and talk about labor. And suddenly he's picking up information about the slaves. When he was done in 1999, he published a book called Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy. And that book, more than anything else, galvanized the modern anti-slavery movement. Desmond Tutu said about it, it is a well-researched, scholarly, and deeply disturbing expose of modern-day slavery. And when Kevin Bales wrote a preface to a revised edition in 2004, he said, when I was writing Disposable People, I had dreams that it might stir people into action, but my dreams were too small. The reality has been great and rapid change in the last 5 years, change that seems to be growing in momentum and reach. Bales has since written 10 more books on slavery. One is on The Slave Next Door, which he published in 2009, which is on hidden slavery in the United States. Farm and house labor are 2 forms, and sex trafficking is, of course, a 3rd form. Because of these, in his initial work, Bales helped found the organization Free the Slaves in the year 2000, and he has served on the board of the Anti-Slavery International, which is in fact the world's oldest human rights organization, founded in 1787. Here, very quickly, is an image of debt bondage slaves in Pakistan forced to make brick. One of the difficulties, of course, is that many of the products, without our knowledge, may be being made with slave or child labor. Many products we buy may have child or slave labor in their production. These, as we've already mentioned, may include charcoal used to make steel in Brazil, sugarcane grown in the Dominican Republic, cocoa used to make chocolate from the Ivory Coast or from Nigeria, artificial flowers made in in China, cotton from at least 7 different countries, clothing made in Brazil, Thailand, or Vietnam, fish from at least 4 countries, and pornography from Russia. And I know that's not a joke. Young girls in Russia may be forced to make pornography. This is just a partial list, and it comes from the 2018 list of goods produced with child labor or slave labor put out by the U.S. Department of State. It makes sense for us, I think, to ask, what do we mean by slavery? Now, most of us as Americans, when we hear the term, think, of course, of ownership of another person as existed prior to the American Civil War. But what has happened is the legal definition of slavery was slowly enlarged across the 20th century. In 2002, the United Nations issued a report called Abolishing Slavery in its Contemporary Forms, and it listed 7 different forms of slavery, plus an 8th activity which frequently is slavery, not necessarily, but frequently is slavery. Let me mention right quickly that all of the reports and documents that I'm referring to here are available online. Just do a Google search on Abolishing Slavery in its Contemporary Forms, and you can locate this document pretty quickly if you'd like to do so. Now, what are these forms? There is, of course, serfdom. Now, that, of course, as we think of old Russian serfdom, is where a person is effectively a slave to the land. And if the ownership of that property changes hands, the slave remains with the property rather than going with the new owner. There is, of course, forced labor. Anytime a person is compelled to do labor which they did not voluntarily agree to do, is essentially included there, although there are some exceptions. The exceptions in the law, and it's a very technical definition, the exceptions in the law include, for example, military service. And the exceptions also include, include labor performed by prisoners who are convicted of crimes, and it includes forced labor during a time of an emergency. So if, for example, Bowling Green, Kentucky was threatened with a serious flood, and we round up all the college students to make sandbags and to pile them up to prevent the town from being flooded, in a sense, we're forcing people to do that, but that would not fall within the legal definition of forced labor. There is, of course, debt bondage. That is a situation, as is common, for example, in agricultural work in India, where a person might owe a debt to another person. They're working for that person, the owner of the land, for example, but somehow the debt continues to grow faster than the person's ability to pay it off. So they are effectively enslaved, having to keep on working for that owner. Trafficking in persons, of course, we think of that as referring mostly to sex trafficking or child trafficking or something like that, but it refers to any form, virtually, of usually taking a person from one location to another, keeping them effectively in bondage where they cannot return. Of course, today, trafficking has become a generic term which is used by many to refer to any form of slavery. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Forced child prostitution and sexual slavery needs no further explanation. Forced marriage and the sale of wives, which unfortunately is still too common in many places in the world. Child slavery and servitude, including child soldiers. The definition of a child soldier was someone who was under 15. It has since been changed to anyone who's under the age of 18. Migrant workers. Now, migrant work are not necessarily enslaved, but they're often effectively enslaved, as this report states. In other words, if a migrant worker goes to another country, for example, to where there's a household job or working for, and the household owner takes the person's passport so that that person effectively cannot leave, they are in fact effectively enslaved. These are the various definitions and components of slavery that are listed in the 2002 UN report. Now, Bales reviewed all of this in his book in 2005 called Understanding Global Slavery, and he came up with a three-part common factors definition. What is common to all of these? Well, one is control over a person that includes the threat of violence. A second part of the definition is that person cannot leave or discontinue their work. And a third part of the definition is the slaveholder profits, but the slave receives only subsistence living. Of course, the statistical question still is very much of interest. How many slaves are there in the world today? Let me mention very quickly how difficult it is to know an answer to that question. Of course, many slaves are hidden, and so there is the great possibility that the number of slaves in the world are undercounted. On the other hand, I do know from other circumstances that people who are activists in causes might like to use shrill numbers. If you're an anti-slavery activist, having a large number draws more public attention to it and probably more public support for your cause. What, of course, people have to do is to take the known and extrapolate as carefully as possible to the unknown. So there are no accurate counts of the number of slaves in the world today. There are only extrapolations, but some of these have been made as carefully as possible. Now, Kevin Bales, in 1999, in his book, his first book, estimated that there are 27 million slaves in the world today. That number, by the way, is still used by the organization he founded, Free the Slaves. Other people have come up with different numbers. The International Labor Organization in 2005 had a number that was about half that, a little less than half that, 12.3 million. It has since, by the way, enlarged that number considerably, as we shall see. A professor at Harvard in 2006 estimated 28.4 million slavers. He upped that to 29 million 3 years later. said they consist of three major types: debt bondage, which he thought consisted of about 18.1 million people, forced labor, 7.6 million people, and trafficked slaves, 2.7 million, about 800,000 of those internationally. The rest are trafficked domestically. Now, the largest estimate is that by the Walk Free Foundation, which in 2018 estimated 45.8 million slaves, with 50% in forced labor, 37% in forced marriages, and 12.5% in sexual slavery. These are overlapping categories, of course. Now, the Global Slavery Index that is published by Walk Free estimated the percentage of people in each country who are slaves. And these range, for example, from 10% in North Korea to 1.2% in the United States to 0.004% in Canada. Now that, of course, is with this largest estimate of 45 million slaves in the world. Now there's an interesting paradox here. The number of people enslaved today may be the highest in human history, although the proportion is likely the lowest. Even if we take these large numbers of over 40 million slaves, that's just 8,000, that's, you can see the percentage there, 0.8% of the world's population, if I'm stating that correctly, are enslaved today. But again, no one knows for sure how many slaves there are in the world today. But each slave's situation remains a tragic story. Of course, a related question that would interest us is how many slaves are in the United States. Now, Bales in 2009 estimated the number was 50,000 and growing. The U.S. Annual Trafficking in Persons Report, and we'll say a little bit about that later, it's published annually by the U.S. State Department. When it first began in 2000, the first year it was published, it estimated 50,000 slaves in the United States, but reduced that thousand by 2003 to 18 to 20,000, and reduced it further to 14.5 to 17.5 thousand in its 2005 edition. Or after that, it quit providing estimates. All later reports have not provided estimates of the number of slaves. I'm not sure whether the writers of the Trafficking in Persons report were thinking that the number was declining rapidly or that the first number was perhaps a vast overestimate. The Walk Free Foundation, on the other hand, in 2018 still estimated 403,000 slaves in the United States. Now, let's look at some hard numbers with that. There is a helpline and a help text where people can report their own or other slavery. And in 2017, the latest number that I have, there were 8,524 cases reported. In 2018, there were 526 convictions for human trafficking in the United States, and 95% of these was for sex trafficking, 5% for forced labor. Now, these numbers, of course, vary greatly from the large estimates. So the question remains, are the estimates too high, or are most slaves just carefully hidden? And I will have to say, I do not personally know the answer to that question or how to arrive at a good answer to that question. Regardless of the accurate number, there are still millions of slaves in the world today, and so it is a good question to ask, why are there so many slaves in the world today? Kevin Bales and others have tried to answer that question by performing economic analyses upon the things that drive slavery. And one reason is that slaves are cheaper than any time in history due to the oversupply of potential slaves. Why is there an oversupply? Part of it is just simply population explosion. There were 2.5 billion people on the planet in 1950. That grew to 6 billion when Kevin Bales was writing his first book in the late 1990s, and there's now 7.6 billion in the world today. A couple of other related factors in Bales' analyses were large-scale agriculture in poor countries has displaced subsistence farmers to slums and led to their entrenched poverty and vulnerability. They may have been living as poor farmers, But because of the national debt that many poor countries sustained, they had to move to large-scale agriculture. And so many of these subsistence farmers were effectively forced into bankruptcy, increasing their vulnerability. The other thing that's happened is, of course, is just simple government corruption. Thailand has laws against child sexual slavery and against sexual slavery of any form. But if you're running a profitable business, you might be able in Thailand to pay off the police, put a lot of money in their pockets to look the other way. And Kevin Bales and others have discovered that even though slavery is now universally outlawed, and most of the versions of slavery that we've looked at are universally outlawed, government corruption plays a major role. And government payoffs to officials plays a major role in keeping it going. The other thing in Kevin Bales' analysis is social unrest and conflict. Where there is social upheaval, slavery seems to persist and survive better. A number of people have argued that slaves today are cheaper than ever in the past, but are they really? Well, in 2005, Kevin Bales wrote Testing a Theory of Modern Slavery to look at precisely that issue. Population growth and entrenched poverty, he argued, has led to a vast oversupply of potential slaves, and with any vast oversupply, the price drops, the value drops. So, American slaves, if you look back at it in the 1800s, had an average value of about $40,000 in 2005, $54,000 in today's money. That was about 1.6 times the annual salary of a free laborer. Now, if you calculate the cost of slaves in ancient Rome or in other places, they suggest similar values. They're not calculated so much in cash as they are in the number of oxen you could buy for the same amount or the amount of land you could buy for the same amount. But as best Bales and others could calculate, they're really comparable value in these ancient times to slaves in 1800s America. However, slaves could be purchased for as little as $90 in many places in 2005, the year that Bales was actually writing this report, which was less than 4% of an annual salary in Africa or in India. And for that reason, slaves are throwaway items. And modern slaveholders have no vested interest in getting them treatment when they're ill, etc., because they're just simply too easy to replace. If you think about an American slave owner who had an injured slave, that slave had value. It was worth nursing him back to health. If the American slave owner had a child, it was worth caring for that child until he was old enough to produce work, etc. But when slaves become throwaway items, as they are today, then the slave holder has no vested interest in caring for them at all. They can replace them. All of us, of course, would want slaves to be freed. But the issue is how. In 2007, Kevin Bales wrote a book entitled Ending Slavery, How We Free Today's Slaves. Now, looking for the best method. One thing that was terribly popular in the 1990s was called slave redemption, purchasing the slave's freedom. Christian Solidarity International, for example, went into Sudan as slaves were being taken from South Sudan to the north, and they would purchase their freedom and return them home. In 2012, it reported that it had freed 80,000 slaves by that method. It was very popular, and by the way, on their website, there are some compelling pictures of children being reunited with their parents. So there's a lot going for it. And yet it also has very undesirable effects. It does, for example, put money in the pocket of the slaveholders. It provides a perverse incentive to go and take more slaves. It even provides an incentive, as has happened on some occasions, to sell your own children, let them be taken to supposed freedom, and then they return home. So slave redemption is not a method that Bales favors. But if not, then what does he recommend? Education, both for us and the potential slaves. How many in the world today really know that there are still millions of slaves in the world? As far as potential slaves, Bales presents cases in which a freed slave returns to their home community, describes what they went through, describes the circumstances by which they were enslaved, and that warning can reduce the likelihood that others in their community are also taken as slaves. Protect the liberators. Every country where there are slaves has liberators who are trying to free them. but they're often under threat. They're often beaten. Some have been killed. One thing that Bales has recommended is for a church to adopt a particular liberator, publish in the region that they've adopted this person, that person is being watched, and that provides a degree of safety for that person. Give the liberators tools. When Bales wrote in 2007, very few liberators had cell phones, for example. One organization has purchased motorcycles for liberators so that they can move more rapidly and easily to rural communities to warn of slavery and to educate people about the dangers of becoming enslaved. Write and enforce effective anti-slavery laws. There are anti-slavery laws in virtually every country, but Bales has discovered that the penalties for being a slaver are typically very weak. And none of the countries that he examined in 2007 had a requirement that slaves who are freed be paid back wages. If we write laws with greater strength, that is a way that we can reduce the number of slaves. Train law enforcement. Bales has argued that even within the United States, law enforcement officers often fail to recognize slavery that might be occurring right in front of them. What are the signs? Let's train law enforcement so they see the signs of potential slavery or what might be slavery so they know how to act upon it. Clone the liberators. Really good liberators should be given apprentices that they can train who can then move off into other areas. And finally, Bales says, let's help the freed slaves heal. Children who have been enslaved are typically way behind on their education. Many are severely malnourished. Adults who are freed need another way to make a living, and they need access to basic services. These are the methods that Bales has recommended. I want to say a few words now about both the United Nations and the United States' efforts against slavery. At the United Nations, for example, you may know that the Universal Declaration in Article 4 says that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, no one shall be held in slavery. Slavery and the slave trade in all their forms shall be prohibited. No one shall be held in servitude. Servitude is a term, you might think, why is that term needed? In UN language, that includes debt bondage, it includes serfdom, it includes forced marriage, it includes forced labor from children under the age of 18. And I think a couple of other things besides that is labeled as servitude in the UN language. The Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989 outlaws the use of children for slave labor, economic sexual exploitation, or as soldiers if they're under the age of 18. The UN Global Compact in age 2000 requires participating businesses to eliminate all forms of forced and compulsory labor and the abolition of child labor by themselves and by their suppliers. It's a voluntary compact. Businesses are not forced to join, but there are 500 companies in the United States at the latest count I saw who are members of it. Ford Motor Company is a member, General Motors is a member, General Electric is a member, Microsoft is a member, a few large corporations like that. They must report regularly to an oversight board on the efforts that they have taken to remove any slavery in the production of their products. Now, I would mention right quickly that there are other major U.S. companies, including Exxon, Walmart, and Amazon, which have not chosen to become members of the UN Global Compact. Finally, let me mention that in 2009, the Human Rights Council of the UN established a special rapporteur on the contemporary forms of slavery, 2008. Now, what that person does is travel around the world and examine various forms of slavery and make regular reports to the Human Rights Council, which has no enforcement powers, by the way, except publicizing the fact that slavery is occurring in different places. As for the United States, there aren't very many human rights issues in which I regard the United States as taking the lead. But if there's one in which I think we have, it is the issue of slavery, human slavery. Now, in the year 2000, the Traffic Victims Protection Act was passed by Congress to fight against human trafficking both in the U.S. and around the world. And that act has subsequently been renewed on several occasions. Now, domestically, it includes sentencing for trafficking and for training and funding state and local police. Internationally, a task force with the Trafficking in Persons Protection Act issues annual reports on countries' anti-trafficking efforts, and it ranks them as follows. Tier 1 are countries that fully comply with the TVPA minimal standards. They're doing everything they can to eliminate slavery. 2 do not fully comply with the standards, but they are making efforts. Tier 2 watch list is governments have made commitments but will be monitored. It's not clear yet that those governments are going to live up to those standards. And Tier 3 is governments that do not fully comply and are not making efforts to do so. Tier 3 countries face U.S. financial sanctions, and some of those have in fact been administered. Let's look for just a moment at the most recent Trafficking in Persons report that the task force has issued. In the 2020 report, just 34 countries were classified as Tier 1, and this included most Western European countries, Canada, the United States, and a few others. 89 countries were listed at Tier 2, Brazil, Italy, Mexico, and Turkey. 45 countries were on the Tier 2 watch list, Cambodia, Pakistan, Sudan. They've made commitments. It's not sure yet that they're going to follow through on them. And 19 were listed as Tier 3, Belarus, Burma, South Sudan, Russia. There's a movement from year to year in terms of where countries are placed. Sometimes a country might be moved from Tier 3 one year up to Tier 2 watch list the next year, or sometimes from the Tier 2 back down to the Tier 2 watch list, and occasionally in other ways. Rarely more than one step at a time, if ever. Now, there are some economic sanctions for Tier 3 that the United States can apply, but mostly it's the publicizing of what countries are doing or not doing with regard to their efforts to end slavery that the State Department has at its disposal. I want to call your attention now to something that is literally brand new, the Slave-Free Business Certification Act. It was proposed by Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, introduced into the Senate on July 20th. What it requires is for very large companies, not all companies, they have to be very large or doing lots of international business, to investigate the presence and use of forced labor by its entity, the entity or its suppliers, including by direct suppliers, secondary suppliers, and on-site service providers. It requires annual reports to the Department of Labor, substantial penalties for noncompliance. I don't think that it has gone into hearings as yet, since it was just introduced in the middle or toward the end of last month. But I have already contacted both Kentucky senators urging their support, and I think I would encourage others to consider doing the same. You can find the Slave-Free Business Certification Act real easily just simply by Googling it. I want to return to Kevin Bales one more time. After 7 more years of travel and research, Bales published Blood and Earth, Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the World in 2016. That is his most recent book. He discovered slavery in other ways: granite used for countertops that come from India, tantalum and tin ore for cell phones and electronics from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And once again, he looked at the corruption and the hardships on the slave and the whole methodology of the slavery that occurs in these particular places. But there was a new feature to his look here, a new focus: slavery's environmental destruction. And let me close with Bales with just 2 quick comments. Because slaveholders are outside the law, 2 quick quotes, I should say. When they mine gold, they saturate thousands of acres with toxic mercury. When they cut timber, they clear cut and burn, taking a few high-valued trees and leaving behind a dead ecosystem. If slavery were an American state, it would have the population of California, but it would be the world's 3rd largest producer of CO2 after China and the United States. There has always been a moral case for stopping slavery. Now there is an environmental one too. To conclude, let's ask the question, is modern-day slavery declining? That is very hard to know for sure, but prosecutions worldwide increased from 5,600 in 2007 to more than 19,000 in 2015. But the number dropped to about 11,000 in 2018 and 2019, which could, of course, mean several things. There is, in fact, less slavery to prosecute, or prosecutors have become less vigilant. Thank you all for your attention. Comments and questions will certainly be welcomed.
Our next hymn will be number 146. Soon the day will arrive. I'm going to play a short introduction, and then if you would, follow along with the words and sing out loud. Soon the day will arrive when we will be together, and no longer will we live in fear. And the children will smile without wondering whether on that day thunder clouds will appear. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Some have dreamed, some have died to make a bright tomorrow, and our vision remains in our hearts. Now the torch must be passed with new hope, not in sorrow, and the promise to make a new start. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me.
Tressa will give the closing reading by Paul Robeson.
Sorrow will one day turn to joy. All that breaks the heart and oppresses the soul will one day give place to peace and understanding, and everyone will be free.
As our gathering ends, we will extinguish the flame in the chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts wherever we go. So go in peace, go in service, and go in love. Please stay with us as we come together for coffee hour and discussion.